February, wind. Now, I want to tell you about a man who owned almost nothing and lacked for even less. February of 1889 laid its cold hand across Indian territory like a punishment nobody had earned. Wind came sideways off the rolling prairie, sharp enough to cut through wool, and frost painted the fence posts white before dawn finished breaking. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the land, the way silence presses down on a cabin that holds only one voice. Harlan Tate stepped off his porch into that wind, carrying an empty bucket. He was 41 years old, lean as fence wire, with hands mapped by scars from 22 years of buildin' and mendin'. The knuckles were swollen from cold, the fingers calloused flat across the pads, but they moved with a care that had nothing to do with rough work, the way a man handles something when he's learned that gentle gets further than force. 80 acres of decent grassland stretched around him in every direction, and every inch of it was his. Not the bank's, not some cattle company's. His. He walked to the frozen creek and cracked the ice with his boot heel. The sound rang out across those 80 acres and came back to him with nobody's echo but his own. He filled the bucket, hauled it to the trough, and counted his cattle the way another man might count his blessings. 42 head, not enough to make a man rich, enough to make a man honest. The cabin leaked in 3 places when rain came hard. He'd patched the roof 6 times since autumn, and reckoned he'd patch it 6 more before spring decided to show. The walls were solid, though. He'd cut the timber himself at 19, dragged it behind a borrowed mule, and raised every beam with his own back and a stubbornness that hadn't softened 1 degree in all the years since. Come evening, firelight told a different story about Harlan Tate. The cabin held a table and 2 chairs carved from fallen cottonwood smooth as riverstone, joined without a single nail. A shelf above the hearth carried 7 books, spines cracked from years of turning. He opened the one he favored most, a collection of verse he'd traded a calf for back in '82, and read aloud to the empty room. His voice was low, careful with the words, the way he handled the cottonwood feelin' for the grain, never forcin' it. Outside, the mustang he'd been working 3 weeks nickered from the corral, answering the rhythm like it understood something the words only hinted at. Harlan closed the book, set it on the carved table, looked at the chair across from him, the one he'd built at the same time as his own, 22 years back. For a reason he'd stopped explaining to himself. Then hoofbeats, distant but steady, coming from the south road. He set the book aside, stepped onto the porch, and watched a fine horse and a finer rider appear at his fence line. This was not a neighbor he recognized. The offer. Della Sinclair had not ridden 9 miles through February wind to admire the view. She pulled her mare to a stop at the fence line and took stock. A cabin that needed roofing, a corral held together by habit and hope. 40-some head of cattle clustered near a half-frozen trough. By any measure in her ledger, this property was worth exactly what she'd calculated, and the man who owned it ought to be grateful for a fair number. Harlan Tate walked toward her with the unhurried stride of someone who had never once in his life rushed to meet another person's schedule. He leaned against the fence post, pulled a blade of winter grass from the ground, and chewed on it like he had all evening and most of tomorrow to spare. "Mr. Tate, my name is Della Sinclair. I run the Double S east of here." She kept her voice the way she kept her books clean, direct. No room for sentiment. "I would like to make you an offer on your 80 acres. Fair price, clean deal, no hard feelings." He looked at her a long moment, not sizing her up the way men usually did, checking her widowhood. Her nerve, her right to ride alone. Just looking. The way a man watches weather coming in and decides whether to step inside or stand his ground. "Ma'am, this dirt's been under my boots since I was 19. He said it simple, the way a man states his own name. "It ain't for sale." Della expected that. She had bought out 11 small outfits in 4 years, and the first answer was always no. What she did not expect was the way his face changed, not closing down but opening up, like a gate swinging the wrong direction. "But if you're hungry after that long ride," Harlan said, tipping his hat with 2 fingers, "supper's about ready, and I make a fair pot of beans." Della's hand was already gathering her reins to turn the mare around. It stopped. Something in the way he offered, not eager, not performing. Just steady as the fence post he leaned on made her swing down from the saddle instead. She tied her horse. She stayed, over beans and cornbread served on tin plates. She ran her fingers along the table's grain. "You purchased this somewhere, made it. Storm knocked a big cottonwood down 3 winters back. Seemed wrong to let it just rot." She noticed the books next, then the carving tools hung neat on pegs, then the way he moved around his small kitchen without hurry or apology, like a man who'd made peace with every square foot of his life and didn't need a single foot more. He asked about her ride. She asked about his cattle. They talked the way people do when the wind is howling outside and the beans are hot and there's no particular reason to rush toward goodbye, riding home under cold stars. Della pressed one hand flat against her saddlebag where the unsigned contract sat. Something had shifted in the weight of things, and she couldn't quite account for it. In any ledger she knew how to keep. What stays? Morning light found Harlan standing at the basin with 2 tin plates in the warmed water. He washed the first one and set it in its place. Picked up the second, the one she'd eaten from, and his hands went still. Water dripped from the rim. He stood like that long enough for the fire to pop twice and the mustang to call from the corral, and then he dried the plate and set it beside the first, close enough that the edges almost touched. Outside, the mustang waited. Harlan climbed the corral fence and sat on the top rail, speaking low and even the way he always did. The horse watched him from 15 feet away, ears forward, body tight with the memory of rough hands that weren't Harlan's. "Easy now. Ain't nobody gonna rush you." Patience instead of force. The only method he'd ever trusted for anything worth keeping. You showed up steady, kept your voice low, and let the wild thing decide for itself when to come close. His jaw tightened as he thought of Della Sinclair, a woman with a cattle empire and a clean contract sitting in his cabin eating beans off a tin plate, running her fingers over his table like it was something worth touching. He gripped the fence rail harder. His shoulders drew up toward his ears the way they did when the world got too close. A wealthy woman didn't ride 9 miles to eat beans with a man whose roof leaked. She rode 9 miles because she wanted something, and what she wanted was 80 acres, not conversation, yet that afternoon. He walked down to the fence where she'd tied her horse. The post had gone loose in the frozen ground. He dug it deeper, tamped the earth firm, wound the wire tighter than any horse required. He told himself it was maintenance. His hands, working steadier than they needed to, told a different story. And that, friends, is where the whole thing could have ended. A polite meal between strangers on a cold night. But some suppers plant seeds that take weeks to bloom, and February, for all its bitter cold, has a way of holding spring inside it like a secret. Fence line. 1 week later, Della Sinclair was riding her eastern boundary for the 3rd time in 5 days, and even the mare had stopped pretending they were checking fence. She spotted him from a quarter-mile off. Harlan stood in the corral with the mustang, one hand extended, palm flat, the rest of him still as timber. The horse paced, circled, paced again. Harlan didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't make a sound, just waited with his hand out, and all the time in creation that laid at his feet like an offering. 20 minutes she watched from the ridge, 20 minutes of patience so pure, it looked like a man praying with his whole body. Then the mustang crossed the distance and pressed its velvet nose into Harlan's open palm, and something in Della's chest shifted that had nothing whatsoever to do with horses. She had built the double S through speed and decision. Buy fast, sell smart, move before the other man blinks. In 4 years she had never once sat still for 20 minutes, waiting for anything to come to her. She rode down to the fence. He'd seen her coming, she was certain of that, but he finished with the mustang before walking over. A man who didn't rearrange himself for company. "Coffee's still warm," he said, "if you got a minute." She had several hours' worth of minutes. As it turned out, they talked about grass and battle and the price of feed in February. The plain vocabulary of people who work land and trust each other enough to speak honestly about it. He showed her the creek, where he watered his herd. She told him about the double S's winter losses, 30, head to the cold snap in January. She came back Tuesday, then Friday. One afternoon she arrived to find him splitting cottonwood rounds behind the cabin, and she picked up the second maul without asking and worked beside him until her shoulders burned. He didn't thank her, didn't fuss, just handed her a cup of water when they finished and said, "You swing that thing like you've been doing it a while." She hadn't, but she didn't correct him. By the second week of February, Harlan had started brewing extra coffee before dawn without admitting to himself why. He handed her a cup, his second-best tin one, and Della noticed a small wildflower carved into the handle. She turned it in her fingers. He watched the creek. Neither of them said a word about it, and the silence held more than most conversations she'd had in years. Cottonwood. Mid-February brought a softness to the air that couldn't rightly be called warm, but wasn't trying so hard to punish. Harlan felt it the way a man with a long winter behind him feels the first breath that doesn't bite. Careful, mistrustful, hoping anyway, Della came by on a Tuesday afternoon, and this time she did not pretend about fence lines. "Show me how you make these," she said, pressing her palm flat against the arm of the cottonwood chair. "I have been wondering since that first supper." Harlan brought out the tool's draw knife, 2 chisels, a hickory mallet he'd shaped himself. He led her to the woodpile, where 3 cottonwood logs lay seasoning, pale and smooth where bark had fallen away like old skin. Storm knocked this tree down 3 winters back. Wood soft enough to carve, but strong enough to hold weight. You just gotta listen to which way the grain wants to go. He showed her the cuts. She tried one herself, the chisel skipping twice before she found the angle. On the 3rd pass, the wood curled away clean, and she looked at the shaving in her hand like she'd discovered something she didn't have a name for yet. They worked side by side through the thin winter sunlight, their breath visible, the quiet between them full, the way a good meal is full, needing nothing added. She helped him mend fence that afternoon. He showed her which grasses his cattle favored through the cold months, pulling up a handful of blue stem to explain why the roots mattered more than the blade. Their worlds overlapped in the practical, grounded way of people who understood that work itself was a kind of conversation, and maybe the most honest kind. Come evening, she stayed for supper. Beans, cornbread, coffee, strong enough to float a horseshoe, and, after, By the fire, she pointed to the book on his shelf. "Read me something." Harlan's hands went still on his coffee cup. He turned it slowly between his palms. Readin' poetry aloud to an empty cabin for 6 years was one thing. The words belonged to nobody, carried no risk, landed soft on walls that couldn't judge. Reading to a woman whose eyes saw everything was a different proposition altogether. But he opened the book, found the page, and read. His voice changed 3 lines in. He didn't notice it, but Della did, the careful steadiness dropping away, replaced by something raw and reaching. The way a creek sounds different when snowmelt fills it and the current finally has somewhere to go. His hands stopped turning the cup. His shoulders settled. For the length of that poem, Harlan Tate forgot to protect himself. Della didn't speak for a full minute after the last line. The fire crackled. A log shifted and sent sparks upward. "Where did you learn to see beauty in broken things?" she asked. Harlan closed the book, ran his thumb along its cracked spine. He had no answer that wouldn't cost him something, so he said nothing, and the question followed him through the cabin door and into sleep. Della rode home through cold dark to a house with 14 rooms and nobody waiting in any of them. She lit one lamp in the kitchen, sat at a mahogany table that had cost more than Harlan's entire cabin, and ate leftover bread alone. The lamp threw her single shadow against the wall. She watched it for a long while before she blew out the flame. What money can't mend. The trouble started with a question Della's foreman asked over morning coffee at the Double S. "You closed that Tate deal yet?" Della set her cup down slower than the question required. "Not yet. He's playing you, boss." The foreman leaned back in his chair, friendly-like, building up the price. "I seen it a dozen times. Small ranchers got one card to play, and that's patience." She wanted to dismiss it, but doubt works the way water works on limestone, finding the crack, widening it slow, until what looked solid turns out to be hollow underneath. Was this real? Or was she a wealthy woman mistaking a poor man's hospitality for something it never was? That afternoon, Della rode to Harlan's gate carrying a revised offer in her saddlebag. Twice the original price. Generous enough to settle every question. She told herself she was being practical, getting clarity, protecting herself the way she'd always protected herself, with numbers, contracts, and the clean certainty of a transaction completed. Harlan was on the porch mending a bridle when she dismounted. His hands kept working the leather as she approached, but she saw his eyes track to the saddlebag, and something behind them dimmed like a lamp turned low. She pulled out the paper. She got 3 sentences into the terms. Harlan set the bridle down, laid it across his knee with the deliberate care of a man putting something away that he won't be picking up again soon. When he looked at her, the warmth around his eyes had gone out entirely, replaced by a distance more absolute than the 9 miles between their properties. "I thought we were past that." "Ma'am, Harlan, it is not. I only wanted to be sure that what is happening here is—" She stopped, the words tangled, because the thought behind them was tangled. She didn't know if she was offering money, or asking permission, or trying to translate something that had no dollar amount into the only language she'd ever been fluent in. "I know what that paper says." His voice was quiet, the way quiet gets when it's holding back something large. "And I told you the first day, this ain't about dollars. I thought maybe you understood that by now." He didn't invite her in. She didn't ask. Riding home, Della looked down at her hands on the reins, the same hands that had signed 40 contracts, shaken on 100 deals, built an empire out of ink and nerve. Today they had held out a piece of paper and watched it ruin something. She thought of Harlan's empty bucket at the creek. She understood it now. She was carrying one of her own, and she'd just tried to fill it with the wrong thing entirely. Her foreman met her at the stable. Close the deal. Della handed him the reins and walked past without a word. Frozen Creek. The cold snap hit 3 days before Valentine's, and it hit with the kind of meanness that makes a man question why he ever loved this land in the first place. Harlan worked from first light to full dark hauling feed, breaking ice that reformed before his back was turned, checking cattle he could barely see through the freezing rain that fell sideways and found every gap in his coat. The cabin leaked worse than any winter he could remember. A steady drip in the corner that he caught in the empty bucket, its rhythm counting off the hours with a patience he did not share. No hoofbeats on the south road. No reason to brew extra coffee. He set one plate for supper, ate his beans standing at the counter, because sitting at the table meant looking at the empty chair, and the empty chair had developed a way of looking back. He told himself this was better. Pride had kept him warm for 22 years. It could keep him warm 22 more. He said it to himself while patching the roof in sleet. Said it while feeding cattle alone in the dark. Said it so many times it started to sound like what it was, a man rehearsing a lie until his mouth believed it even though his hands, reaching for a second coffee cup that wasn't there, did not. Then the youngest calf went down. He found her at dusk, shivering in the mud beside the creek. Too cold to stand. 42 cattle and this one the smallest, born late in the season. Never quite right, had stopped trying. Harlan dropped to his knees in the freezing mud. He gathered that calf against his chest and carried her inside like she weighed nothing and mattered more than everything. Set her by the fire, wrapped her in his own blanket, the one off his bed. Sat on the floor beside her through the long night, one hand on her ribs, feeling each shallow breath and willing the next one to follow. The fire threw shadows across the cottonwood table, the chair where Della had sat, the book of poetry open to the page he'd read aloud while she listened, and the whole cabin changed shape around her silence. He had pushed her away for the same reason he'd built this cabin alone at 19, because needin' nothing from nobody meant nobody could take nothing from you. But somewhere between that first supper and this frozen night, the equation had changed. The pride he'd carried like armor wasn't protecting his dignity. It was locking it inside a cabin that leaked in 3 places and held one man and one dying calf, and not enough warmth between them. Can pride and humility exist in the same heart at the same time? That frozen night. With his hand on a calf's ribs and his eyes on an empty chair, Harlan discovered they must. Because the bravest thing a proud man can do isn't refuse the world. It's open the door. Come dawn. The calf stood on wobbly legs. Harlan opened the cabin door to pale winter light that fell across the floor like a question. The air tasted different. Not warm, not spring, but something underneath the cold had shifted. The way a creek shifts under ice before anyone can see it moving. If she came back, he would not hide behind his fence post. Valentine's Eve. Della. Sinclair had faced down bankers, drought, and a territory full of men who believed a woman had no business owning cattle. Not one of those fights required the particular courage it took to ride up Harlan Tate's South Road on Valentine's evening carrying a bottle of good wine and nothing else. No contract in the saddlebag, no numbers in her head. Just wine and the terrifying hope that a man who had every right to leave his door shut might open it anyway. The cold snap had broken overnight, leaving the air still and almost gentle, like February had finally exhaled after holding its breath for weeks. She rode slowly. The prairie stretched wide and quiet around her, and she gave herself every opportunity to turn the mare around. She did not take a single one. Light showed in his windows. That was the first thing. He hadn't gone dark. She dismounted at the fence, the post he'd reset, sturdy and deep, and walked to the cabin door. She knocked once, the way you knock when you aren't sure you've earned an answer. Harlan opened the door. Behind him, Della saw the cabin and understood. Clean. Every surface wiped down. Floor swept to the corners. Fire built up steady and bright. The cottonwood table held 2 tin plates, 2 forks, 2 cups, his best ones. The pair he kept on the top shelf where dust couldn't reach them. And beside the plates, a fresh carving small enough to fit in a woman's palm, a wildflower, its petals curving open, made from the same cottonwood as the table it sat on. He had been hoping she would come. "I did not bring a contract," Della said, "or a price. I can see that." His voice was careful, not cold, but careful, a man holding a door open without knowing yet what would walk through it. "I brought wine, and if you will have me at your table again, I will not make the mistake of trying to buy what can only be given." Harlan stepped aside. They cooked together this time. He showed her how he made the cornbread, coarse-ground meal. A little honey, cooked in the cast-iron skillet he'd carried from Missouri at 19. She stirred the beans and burned her wrist on the pot handle, and he wrapped it with a cold cloth, without fuss, his fingers quick and gentle. They moved around each other in the small kitchen, the way 2 people do, when the space is tight and neither one minds the closeness. Supper was quiet at first. 2 people eating beans and cornbread, drinking good wine from tin cups, listening to the fire. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 folks who had run out of things to hide behind and were learning what was left when the hiding stopped. Della set her cup down, looked at the wildflower carving between them, looked at the man who had made it. "I have more money than I know how to spend," she said, "and I have been sitting in a 14-room house, feeling poorer than you will ever be." Her voice had lost its boardroom edges. "You know who you are, Harlan. Every piece of furniture in this cabin, every poem in that book, every hour with that mustang. You know exactly who you are. I have been buying things my whole life, trying to answer that question, and I still can't." The fire crackled. Harlan looked at her across the table. This woman who could purchase his 80 acres 10 times over, sitting in his leaky cabin with a burned wrist wrapped in his cloth, telling him the plainest truth either of them had spoken. He set his cup down, met her eyes, let the silence hold one more breath. "I know who you are," he said. "You're the woman who stayed for beans." To neighbors, Della laughed. It came out of her like something that had been locked in a room for years and finally found the door standing open. Not loud, not performing, just warm and uneven and real, filling the small cabin the way firelight fills a room, reaching into the corners, softening every hard edge, making the whole space feel like it had been waiting for exactly this sound. Harlan watched her laugh and felt something inside his chest resettle, like a fence post finally finding solid ground after years of leaning. He reached for the bottle and poured the last of the wine into both cups. Good wine in tin cups, the kind of contradiction that only makes sense when you stop keeping score. He lifted his cup. The wine caught the firelight, deep red and steady, warm as the room. Warm as the evening, warm as the thing growing between 2 people who had come to this table by separate roads and discovered they'd been heading the same direction all along. To neighbors, Harlan said. Della raised hers to meet it. To stubborn, proud, wonderful neighbors, the cups touched with a sound like a small bell rung once in a quiet church clear, certain, carrying further than it had any right to. Outside, the February wind still blew across the rolling prairie, but softer now, gentler, like it had spent its worst and was ready to let something else take over. Through the window, the fence line stood straight and dark against the sky. The same fence where a wealthy woman had once made an offer and a poor man had answered with beans instead of a price. Same fence, same two people, everything between them. Changed. The empty bucket sat by the cabin door, not empty anymore, filled with fresh water from the creek, which had started just barely, just enough to hear if you pressed your ear to the ice to crack. Not thawed, not spring, but the first whisper of moving water underneath. The sound a frozen thing makes when it remembers what it was before the cold came, and decides to become it again. On the cottonwood table between them, 2 tin cups with wine still warm inside them. A bottle with its last pour given. A carved wildflower with its petals open. And a book of poetry with a cracked spine that had spent 6 years being read to an empty room and would never need to be again. Everything in this cabin had been made by hand or earned by patience, and not a single piece of it was for sale. Harlan looked at the woman across from him. Della looked back. No contracts between them. No ledgers, no saddlebag offers or revised terms or clean deals. Just firelight and beans and the quiet, terrifying, beautiful knowledge that 2 people had stopped trying to protect themselves from each other and found that what remained was better than what they'd been defending. True dignity ain't about what you own. It's about knowing your own worth and sharing it generous. The fire held. The wind softened. And out past the fence line, out past the 80 acres and the 42 cattle and the leaky roof that would need patchin' come March. The frozen creek sang its first thin song of thaw, a sound so small you'd miss it if you weren't listening. But as certain as anything the prairie has ever promised. Even the coldest February remembers how to turn toward spring. 2 tin cups on a cottonwood table. Firelight steady. Enough.